I was waiting for the music to die down. Okay, all right. Now it is time for our next panel, which is an awesome follow-up to our previous one. This is called Covering Trump 2.0 Challenges Facing Journalists in Washington, D.C. Our chair is Evan Smith, who is the co-founder of the Texas Tribune and a senior advisor for Emerson Collective. So let's bring up our panelists. Thank you.
That last one was for you. Great. Okay. Thank you for that introduction. I'm Evan Smith. I'm a senior advisor at Emerson Collective. I'm the co-founder and former CEO of the Texas Tribune. I'm so happy to be back at ISOJ again, and especially to share the stage with three excellent journalists who wake up every day focused on how best to cover this administration and the extraordinary moment we're in. All of us in this room know the fire hose of news is turned up to the highest setting at all times these days. The obstacles placed in the path of reporters searching for the truth have never been more numerous or more formidable, unless, of course, you luck out on signal. And they include credible, persistent, unprecedented threats to press freedoms. Efforts to undermine faith and trust in journalists and journalism have been underway for nearly a decade, and they've mostly worked, probably longer than that. We're at an inflection point. What do we do? How do we think about this critically important work? Is keep on keeping on enough of a plan, or is it time for a new strategy and a new set of tactics? Our distinguished guests won't be allowed to leave until they tell us. Let me introduce them. On my left is Eugene Daniels, the newly minted senior Washington correspondent for MSNBC, and later this spring he'll add the title of co-host of the network's Saturday and Sunday show, The Weekend, alongside Jonathan Capehart and Jackie Alemany. He previously reported on the White House for Politico and was co-author of Politico Playbook. This year, in the most chill time to have the gig, he's also president of the White House Correspondents Association. Fun fact, yes, clap for that, that's fine. Fun fact, he grew up and played high school football up the road from here in Killeen, when his father, a lieutenant colonel in the Army, was stationed at Fort Hood.
And have a Texas tattoo on my ribs to prove it.
Which he told me he will not show us. I asked. To the left of Eugene is Elizabeth Kennedy, who just began her 5th year as the White House editor at the New York Times. Previously, she served as the deputy White House bureau chief for the Associated Press, working closely with its White House and congressional teams to guide coverage of national security, law enforcement, and election security. She was also the AP's deputy international editor in Washington. Before that, she ran AP bureaus in Bangkok, New Delhi, Beirut, and Nairobi, reported from Somalia, Burundi, and Kenya, and was an editor in New York working with reporters on the 2004 presidential campaign. Finally, to the left of Elizabeth, my old pal Ashley Parker, back in Austin, always glad to have her here, staff writer at The Atlantic, a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner. She previously spent 8 years at the Washington Post, where she covered all 4 years of President Donald Trump's first term, was White House bureau chief during President Joe Biden's first 2 years, and covered the 2024 presidential campaign as the paper's senior national political correspondent. Before that, she spent more than a decade at the New York Times, where she covered the 2012 and 2016 presidential campaigns and Congress. She's also a political analyst for NBC and MSNBC. This is a very high-quality panel. Give these guys a big hand. Thank them so much for being here. Great. So, Ashley, having made my one signal joke of this panel, I do want to actually seriously ask you about the last week at The Atlantic. You and yours have had quite a time since the publication of that story.
Yes. I mean, I had absolutely nothing to do with it.
That's okay. That's all right.
And in certain ways, Jeff had nothing, right? I mean, he was just a sort of passive recipient to war plans. But what's been striking to me in this moment, having covered Trump since 2015 in some form or fashion, and in this world, and I'm sure Elizabeth and Eugene feel this, everything moves so quickly, right? I mean, and some of that is deliberate. I was talking to people in the administration who were explaining the first day in office, and this will return to the signal stuff, but they were saying, look, we went in, he gave 3 speeches, right? He gives his address, his inaugural address, he addresses a congressional luncheon, he goes into the Oval, he takes more than 100 questions from the media, he goes out to balls which need to be covered, he signs 26 executive orders, a bunch of them are on immigration, he pardons or grants clemency to all the J6ers, and they say, this is deliberate because they said if we had only done the executive orders on immigration, the narrative from the media would have been, you guys are horrible people, you're trying to separate families, you're anti-immigrant, you're racist. But they said their attitude was like, screw you, you have to choose. You can either go all in on pardoning the J6ers, you can go all in on the immigration executive orders, you can cover him at the balls, you can cover his speeches, but you can't do all of it, and that's the point. And that sort of set the tone, and I feel like we've all been scrambling to figure out what to cover, how to cover. And so what was striking to me, going back to Signal in this moment, was this thing that almost never happened in Washington happened, which is there was a story where the world sort of stood still and everyone in the country was aware of this Atlantic piece where Jeff Goldberg was on a signal chain with all the top national security administration officials about war plans. And then there were 2 hearings that were pre-scheduled, but where you had Ratcliffe and Tulsi Gabbard already set to testify. And again, this thing that never happens in Washington, or it feels like, everyone was captivated across the country just watching these hearings. And I feel like it is so rare in this moment, in this day and age, in this administration, for sort of the world to stand still over a media story about an administration. And that has been the most striking thing about this to me.
Eugene, Elizabeth, I'll come to you with the same thing in a second. Eugene, what did we learn about the White House this week? What did you learn about the White House from the reaction, from the fallout, from the aftermath of this?
Yeah, I think it was a relearning of the doubling down, tripling down, quadrupling down, and the circling of the wagons, right? Because at the very beginning of it, they copped to it. They said, the NSC told Jeff, hey, this is real, we're not happy about it, we'll look into it, kind of thing.
Which, side note, I was kind of stunned by
Yeah,
that they
so
just copped to it. Yeah.
They immediately said, like, this is a thing. Right?
Well, they copped and they uncopped,
and then they uncopped.
copped and they uncopped, right?
And then it became, don't trust Jeff because Jeff is a discredited journalist. He's not, as many of you know, he is not. He's a great one. And then it went to, these aren't war plans, they're attack plans. And they're not even attack plans. Nothing was confidential, nothing, it was secret, but not, completely secret. And they went back and forth. And now they're kind of at the space where it is, we're too focused on it as the media. Nobody in the country cares about it, which isn't true.
Right.
It doesn't tell, for them, it doesn't tell you anything about how we operate, and they want to move on. I think that's the thing that always happens every time there's a scandal in Trump world. And what I found really interesting was that Mike Waltz, who started the chat, is the one that's getting all of the hits and taking the hits, even from President Trump himself. And he said, Mike Waltz did it, but he's a good guy. He's, it's okay. He learned his lesson. But Pete Hegseth, who put all of the information in there, the Secretary of Defense, kind of isn't, right? And he's being supported in a different way. And so all of those kinds of dynamics tell you something. There is a lot of irritation within the Trump world writ large, whether that's in the White House or outside of it, that a head has not rolled and likely isn't going to. But what's really interesting is that President Trump seems to be more irritated that it seems that Mike Waltz had Jeffrey Goldberg's phone number in some way, shape, or form.
That his contact was in his phone somehow. I mean, Elizabeth, this idea of the Trump administration always wants to move on from the thing to the next thing is true. This has had a little bit more hang time, hasn't it?
It's definitely had more hang time, despite their really kind of heroic attempts to try to change the subject. I think it was yesterday, although time is sort of a flat circle, so I don't remember exactly when it was. Trump got up and gave a speech about tariffs in a sort of desperate attempt to let's talk about something else.
Right.
But I also found that wonderful scoop from The Atlantic to be a very pure sort of distillation of Trump's desire and strategy of just bending reality to his will if I say that this information is not classified and no big deal, then it is not classified and it is no big deal, period, end of story. Everyone closes ranks around him. There were sort of whispers that I think that we definitely picked up on, and I know, certainly the media picked up on about, okay, he's kind of all in for Hegseth, but he's maybe a little bit annoyed with Waltz. But I think for the most part, for people looking at it from the outside, this is a pretty unified administration. They all just decide what we say is the reality, and that's the story that we're going with. I mean, we can't say it enough. These were secret military plans that, by any kind of national security measure, could have upended a mission. American lives were at risk. There was really no question about how sensitive and serious this was. The White House is taking a strategy of semantics about it. It was not classified. It was classified. It was a battle plan. It was a war plan. But the reality is very striking about what happened in that group chat. But again, the White House has just decided that we say what the reality is.
And one of the differences this time, we'll talk about this over the next hour, from this administration to last, is that there are no apostates in this administration, right? The closing of ranks is easy. Everybody is falling in line. There were people in the last administration the first time who might have actually said on the side, this is bad, this is terrible, break ranks. No one is breaking ranks this time, actually, right? Yeah,
and that's exactly right. I also, picking up on what Elizabeth said, to me, that's one of the most striking differences, is this sense that he can, Norman Vincent Peale, he can bend reality to his will. And that's what we're seeing. And in part, that's because he's surrounded by people who will allow that to happen. But I think he has learned the lessons of the 2020 election, which he lost, and the lessons of January 6th, which was a deadly insurrection and attack on the U.S. Capitol, is that if he repeats something enough, he can get enough of the American public to believe it. And there is now a huge portion of the American public who believes that he did not lose the 2020 election to Joe Biden, and who believed that January 6th was not a big deal, or it was a day of love, or, as Steve Bannon recently told me, a Fedsurrection, right? There are, because he repeated it and repeated it and repeated it and repeated it. And I think the lesson he took from that is that he can go into the White House and he can bend reality to his will, and he can, in a lot of it turns out, a lot of a democratic society functions on sort of norms and niceties and social constructs. And the thing he understands now that he didn't understand in the first term or wasn't willing to do is that a lot of them, it turns out, you can run roughshod over. And you see that on every level, that they are talking now about, if you don't like judicial rulings, you'll just ignore them.
Right. Or impeach the judges.
Or impeach the judges. And Eugene can talk more about this, but I remember, there were instances in the first term where he would try to ban a single journalist because he didn't like their reporting or what they had said on television. And there were people around him in his White House who would tell him, you can't do that, right? You can't do that. There'll be political backlash. The First Amendment. You'll pay a price. It's not worth it. And now what he's learned is that, the White House Correspondents Association doesn't actually get to choose who's in the pool, and there doesn't need to be a pool at all. And so we're seeing him push the boundaries to the absolute outer limits in a way we did not see the first term, because I think of that belief that he can bend reality to his will.
And the guardrails that existed turned out to be made of paper. And he can just break through them, and there are no consequences, and he goes, oh, I can do this, right?
Yeah, part of it is also poisoning the well of truth, right? So if he's saying what he wants for a long time, the people who love him will believe that, but then other people might not believe anything, right? And that's also part of the process. And so we as journalists, when we come to folks with real information, verifiable information that we know to be true, that our lawyers have looked at and also know to be true, people won't believe it because the well is already poisoned about truth, right? And those guardrails have just been norms. What legal obligations or what legal bounds do people have
Yeah.
to be able to go into the Oval Office, right? The Associated Press is in court currently fighting about that because of viewpoint discrimination, which is something that you can't do. But the White House, they started going through the process of this court case, they kind of copped to viewpoint discrimination, which is the actual legal thing that you're not supposed to be able to do. And they're not arguing that they didn't allow the Associated Press into the Oval Office or into any other events because they didn't like that they called it the Gulf of Mexico versus the Gulf of America. They're saying, no, that is the reason, but we can do that. And I'll never forget, it was the 19th of this year, January, and I was talking to someone who had literally just got off the phone with the person who was going to be in the DOJ. And they said, get ready, because the person that was going to be in the DOJ, they told them, get ready because we're going to stretch the bounds of everything. And they said, everything legal, cultural. They said, no, everything. We are pushing the bounds on everything. And they said, you guys aren't going to be able to stop us because you don't know how to battle that. And I think that, to me, kind of, and then we saw it immediately, as Ashley was saying on the 20th, that has continued since then.
You three have all had experience covering Trump and his previous administration, first time. So you actually have a reference point. On the one hand, I'm tempted to ask you what you learned that was useful for you this time. On the other hand, this seems like such an aberration, what's going on right now, even compared to the first time, that I wonder if that comparison is apt. But Elizabeth, you first. If you think about leading teams covering that first administration and that White House versus now, what are the similarities, what are the differences?
There are a lot of differences, actually. I mean, there's a lot of differences. He's much more empowered. He's much more confident. He's far less distracted by the Russia investigation and all of this. He feels that he has a real mandate. I mean, he won this election fair and square, and by it wasn't the landslide.
And even won the popular vote.
And he won the popular vote. I mean, he won this election. A big portion of the American people voted for him. He has learned a lot of lessons. I mean, I think I can speak to the lessons that we as journalists have learned, but he has also learned a lot of lessons. He has learned, as Ashley and Eugene said, that a lot of these rules are really just norms. And he is definitely willing to push beyond it. I mean, in terms of the separation of power, I mean, he's already challenging the judiciary, Congress's, spending power he's challenging. He's just, he was just out saying that although Congress has appropriated all of this money, he's just not going to spend it because he doesn't want to spend any money on, immigration and this sort of thing. So, I mean, he has learned a lot of lessons about what he can get away with. I would say that is kind of probably one of the main ones. And I think as journalists, I mean, I think that we need to approach it, and we are approaching it with an open mind. What is he trying to accomplish? What is he doing that is working? What is he doing that's not working? But I think for the lessons that we've learned as a team, I think we have to keep in mind what their strategy is. And their strategy, as Ashley was saying, is a flood zone strategy. They're also trying in more explicit ways to guide what we say, which is part of what they're doing with the AP. Fundamentally, that's what that is about.
Right.
So every day does seem in certain ways, we're running around, there's a million stories, and that is true. We have to cover that. We need to be, part of that and give people that information. It's important in every way, but we also need to step back and keep our eyes on the big stories, the big changes, how Trump sees power, how he's changing the American presidency, any inklings of corruption, the relationship with Elon Musk. I mean, these are big, meaty issues, and I think the danger is being, pulled down every day into the minutia, which I don't buy the argument that isn't important. I don't buy the argument that we shouldn't be paying attention to these things. We do need to be paying attention to them, but they do add up to something bigger. So.
Ashley, this is the fundamental tension right now. On the one hand, you want to keep your eye on the stuff that's really important. On the other hand, you don't want to be complicit in being desensitized to some of the stuff that Elizabeth is talking about. I mean, the fact is that he is running through all of the things that we all took for granted in previous situations like this. We can't, as the press, in the interest of keeping our eyes on the ball, shrug our shoulders at that stuff, right? The framing of stories has got to acknowledge how aberrational this is.
Of course, and one thing on that, which is interesting, and this was true at the Post sometimes, my editors would ask for a weekend story on whatever. And I would say, hey.
The one editor.
No, and I would
feel
say,
attacked.
And I would say like, but I've written this. I wrote 10 stories on this. And my editor would correctly, smartly, and rightfully say, so much has happened. I think there would maybe be real value in just pulling it all together and synthesizing for readers, what's going on with the perfect call with Russia. And so I would begrudgingly do it, and then that story would sort of go gangbusters because it is hard to follow this stuff, and that's what readers are craving, right? Something that pulls it all together and explains the details and the scoops, but why it matters and what direction this could go in. So I agree with that. One thing that I think is largely the same, but a little bit different that struck me was, so I covered Trump's 2015-2016 campaign for the New York Times. And right before I left for the Post, he had won. So I left for the Post during the transition. He had won, and the New York Times, and I have to assume this is true for newsrooms all across the country. I can just speak to the Times because I was there then. Nobody knew what to do, right? You had a bunch of editors and reporters who had not expected him to win, who had never been to a Trump rally, who had never spoken to a Trump voter, and who didn't even have Hope Hicks's number in their cell phone, right? There were 4 of us at the New York Times who knew anything about Donald Trump and his movement. So Maggie Haberman and I, we had covered Trump. We were called to the DC bureau to do a brown bag to explain this new leader to the editors and reporters there. And it was like we were explaining like aliens, to a bunch of sociologists desperate to understand. And everyone kept on trying to apply the sort of normal Washington framework to him, right? It would be, he did this thing, but then he tweeted out this other scandal, and is that because he's playing 4-dimensional chess? Which is what often happened in Washington, right? Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer is doing one thing to make someone else do another thing so that in 2 weeks they can jam something through. And the answer was no. He is trying to win, and he's a consummate real estate deal guy and showman. He is trying to win the minute, the hour, the week. He is trying to win over whoever is directly in front of him in that moment. That is who he is at his core. And so they would say, well, what do you mean he told the Dreamers, he brought the Dreamers into the Oval Office and he told them, you're the best among us. I want to staple a green card to your diploma. But then he brought in the sheriffs and he told them, hey, there's some Dreamers in the outer Oval. We could just deport them all. Everyone's like, that makes no sense. But if you understand Donald Trump, it does make sense because he's in front of the Dreamers, he wants to win them over. Now he's in front of the sheriffs. And when there was that tension, which you often saw in the first term, he would always retreat, almost always retreat to where the far right base was. So there would be that tension, and then he would move to where the base was. And I think that is still largely true. He's trying to win the day, the minute, the hour, the group in front of him. But the one thing I have been struck by on tariffs and on some of these economic things is he's sort of spoken a couple times with a more long-term view when he's talked about, in a way that his fellow administration officials won't, there might be some short-term pain. And he's also said, at one point I was very struck by, he said, look, the Chinese think of things in centuries and millennia. We think of things in quarters. And so it's interesting to kind of watch, is this an evolution of a man who is learning patience and learning to play the long game? Because in general, that has not been his strength.
Eugene, what's the difference as you see it from the last time to now?
I think the biggest difference is the people around him, right? You talked about that a little bit. In the before times, in that first 4 years, there were people who would literally take things off his desk or slow walk them from the EEOB so that he would, get distracted and not want to sign something and do something that in their minds was not politically advantageous for him.
They were managing Trump.
They were managing up, right? Which is something that all of us that have editors or jobs, we all try to do. Like, you're trying to make them do what you want to do. And I think largely that was because most, if not all of those folks that were around him believed that at the end of his 4 or 8 years as president, there would be a different Republican Party. They would go back to the Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Mitt Romney Republican Party. And so now that is not the case. The people around him one, do not believe that, because they'd be crazy to believe that that thing is happening. Two, and probably most importantly, they see their job as making sure he gets what he wants, right?
Right.
Or they're true believers, right? And so those kinds of people were not really around him, or if they were, they weren't in the jobs they were being blocked out by people like the chiefs of staff, or they were being blocked out by Hope Hicks at times, right? Who was very much someone who stuck around and supported him and defended him from people who probably would harm him politically. That's not happening anymore, right? And so you see the operation now just kind of moving full steam ahead with the things that he wants, and everyone jumping on board. That's why it's so easy for everyone to circle the wagons, because if everyone agrees, then that's the case. You think about during the Trump years, the first couple of years especially, all of the infighting that came out because they had all of these different factions, people planning stories and wanting to shiv each other. That's not really happening, but that's because these people agree with each other.
Well, that's why the Waltz thing is so
Exactly.
is so unusual for the last 2 months, right? Is that you finally have somebody who's kind of on the bubble. Ashley, one thing that occurs to me to what Eugene is saying is that you all covering the last Trump term may have had different access issues or relationship issues with people who were close to Trump, whereas right now, everybody around Trump, everybody in the cabinet views you guys as the worst thing in the world. And I'm not sure that everybody viewed you that way even the cabinet secretaries, right? Like the kind of grievance as a theory of the case has taken over in this second term. And I just wonder if it hamstrings your ability to get stories, to talk to people, or is that mostly for show, and actually when no one is watching, they are more willing to deal with you?
I think it's a mix. It does feel more challenging to get stories, in part just because they're more disciplined, right? And we benefited from the competing factions in the first term, and we benefited from a president who often in real time responded to what he saw on the front page of newspapers and what he saw on TV. And so that gave these warring factions an incentive to leak, because they knew if Trump read something, because I would sometimes ask, if you want to make a case on steel tariffs, your whatever level inside advisor, why don't you just walk into the Oval and make it, right? Like, why are you doing this bank shot where you make it to me and then you hope I get invited on Morning Joe and I say it on Morning Joe and then the president sees it, and then why don't your top advisor, why don't you just make it to the president? But that was how Trump received information. So it is more challenging, although I think there was a myth the first time that being a journalist was just like people were calling like 1-800
National Pickleball.
It was still in the beat, but there are still people. It's still possible to do the job. There's a public attitude towards journalists, and there's a private attitude towards journalists. And the last thing I'll say, bringing it back to Mike Walls, is I have been, as Eugene said, it seems like in this moment his biggest crime is that he had a journalist's cell phone number in his phone. And I have been struck by the fact that, and again, this is because everybody is performing for an audience of one, which is the president, and you can't apologize, you can't admit mistakes, you can't broker any resistance. When in doubt, double down, and when doubling down doesn't work, triple down. But I have been stunned that Mike Walls didn't just say, of course I had Jeff Goldberg's cell phone in my phone. I was a member of Congress. Part of my job was to talk to journalists, to try to persuade them of my policies, of my initiatives. Of course I had his number. That's what made me a good congressman and an effective advocate for MAGA policies and for my constituents. And it was a mistake. I mean, how many of us have sent things to the wrong
person, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Elizabeth, what about Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary? You'd take Sean Spicer, wouldn't you, today?
I will say about that question about Caroline Leavitt, I think that she is doing the job that she was hired to do. And again, to the audience of one question, she in a lot of ways has an audience of one, right? The president needs to be happy with the job that she's doing. She's very on message. The White House briefing, and I'm not minimizing the issues with the White House briefing, but that's always an antagonistic relationship between journalists and the people speaking for the White House. the White House, no matter who is in it, is there to make themselves look as good as possible, to obscure bad stories, and to spin. That's it. Like, that's the job, right?
Right.
And so we, as journalists, go into that briefing room. I say we, even though I'm an editor, so I don't go into the briefing room. Don't kill me. Don't kill me.
In spirit.
You go into the room with that knowledge. Okay. The Trump White House is a different beast in many ways, but fundamentally, you go in there looking to push on stories. You go in there looking to, in an attempt to get to the truth. Like that's what we do there, whether it's Caroline Leavitt or anyone else.
Or anybody else. I want to come to you as the president of the White House Correspondents Association, specifically on the question of that room and access. The threats to journalists at the moment, lawsuits, weaponization of the FCC, we're going to defund PBS and NPR. I mean, all the things that we've heard. The access issue is, in some respects, to me, the most concerning, right? AP, Julie Pace will be here in a little while on stage with me. AP was in a hearing yesterday trying to get back their access, arguing that this, sort of free speech is at the center of the fight here. But as Ashley alluded to, there's a secondary issue, which is that the White House has now said, we're going to take back control over deciding who gets to be in the room. Right? We're going to decide who's in the press pool, who gets to cover events. That used to be the purview of the Correspondents Association. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the status of that right now? Because again, as aberrations go, that's a pretty big one.
Let me take off my MSNBC hat and put on my WHCA one.
Yes.
It's where it was a few weeks ago, right? Nothing has changed. And for a lot of people, trying to explain to them why it is important for White House correspondents and the people that are covering the White House to have control over who's in the room, it may not be, it's not that intuitive, right? And so this is the reason why. Because at the end of the day, the people that are being covered should not choose the people that are covering them. Point blank, period, right? That is at its simplest the distillation of what we're dealing with. And him in his first 4 years, and presidents for a very long time, decades, have allowed that relationship to be what it is because they knew that they are stronger if the people who are asking them questions are people who are well-informed, people who are best sourced, people who are talking to the people that are around them in the Oval Office, right? That has always been a strength for presidents and administrations. And frankly, they don't want to deal with the BS of having to coordinate all of those things, right? Why would they want, the young people that work for them to have to spend all day figuring out who needs to go in this pool? That was something that the WHCA did, right? And we will continue to fight to be able to do later. But
it went from being a process issue to a substance issue.
Right, and so there's two different issues. There's the pool issue, which is one thing, and the issue with the AP, which has, both have created a chilling effect within journalism, right? And the AP issue is that the AP made an editorial decision that because they are a global entity that covers, 4 billion people, I think, a day read them, or they reach that many people all around the world, that Gulf of Mexico was what they were going to call it. To be very clear, there are a lot of news organizations that are still calling it the Gulf of Mexico. Some of them are using the AP style book, but some of them made their own decision to do so. And the White House going to the AP, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, MSNBC, going to an institution and saying, we are taking something away from you because you won't do what we say, that is a problem.
That's the
right?
problem.
That is the problem with what's going on with the AP, and that's why they, and the AP and us worked behind the scenes to try to figure, try to give them an off ramp and figure something out here. But the White House continued, and the AP did their lawsuit. We did our, we did an amicus brief. We've been showing up to the court case because it is important that the American people know this isn't just about the Associated Press. And Julie Pace did this in a Wall Street Journal op-ed earlier this week, where she talked about that, today it's the AP, tomorrow maybe it's another news organization, or maybe it's someone else, right? And so that's the slippery slope that folks are talking about.
Ashley, I have a question for you on that. So civilians normally don't think about the Associated Press. But this story has gotten, speaking of hang time and sort of visibility, I think that there are sort of average people outside of our world who are talking about this AP story. And the question I've gotten from a bunch of people is, why didn't the entire White House press corps walk out? Why haven't every reporter and every organization in solidarity with the AP? I know this sounds like something that only Aaron Sorkin would be able to script, right? But why hasn't everybody said, if you do this to the AP, you could do it to all of us, we're walking out en masse? Why not?
I'll take part of that.
Let's kick it back,
Yeah,
Eugene, briefly.
I'll take part of that question, and part of the reason is.
But I do want to come back.
Ashley's not getting off easy, it seems.
Yeah.
Part of the reason is the people that are doing the work every single day in the White House, that have hard passes, the editors, those are not the people that are making that decision. And I think that's something important for the American people to understand, right? Going into the White House on behalf of your news organization, you are not making the decision to boycott something. You are not making the decision to walk out. As someone who's tried to work and get collective action, I am not talking to Ashley Parker typically on with those conversations, right? I'm talking to people way above them. And so that is something, if people want to be upset about those kinds of things, it is not the reporters themselves, the editors even, that deserve that ire. And at the end of the day, as I've said in public statements, is every news organization has to make decisions for themselves, right? I have a certain decision that I would make if I was in charge. I'm also not in charge, right, of any of these organizations. And the WHCA, we don't tell people what to do. That's not how we do. We try to operate and bring people together. But if they don't want to come,
But you understand the instinct that some people have in thinking there should be some kind of big response.
I get that. I mean, I'm going to punt a little that part of it is above my pay grade, but to answer a different question, in the first term, there was a lot of talk of sort of a similar version of, they're lying to you from the briefing room. Why don't you just walk out of the briefing? Why do you cover the briefing? And my personal view on that was, it's our job to cover the White House, and anytime I have the ability to get access, I want that level of access. And it doesn't mean I needed to take what the press secretary told me as truth, and I had the ability to give it context and nuance and tell my readers, Sean Spicer said this, that's a lie, and here's why my reporting shows that's a lie, and that helped advance the story and helped advance the public's understanding of the story. It was also the same thing. There was this other movement of why do we cover the tweets? And my view on why do we cover the tweets is the tweets were, in that moment, they were statements from the President of the United States, and they were a window into what the President of the United States was thinking in that moment, and that mattered. That meant something.
Yeah, one difference between then and now is no one is questioning whether the stuff he says on social media, Truth Social, is news. Now it is news. No one questions that. So let me ask you about the name calling, since we're talking about features of the first and particularly the second term. You work for MSDNC.
No,
well,
I work for MSNBC.
Right? You work for the failing New York Times. You work, as of this week, for The Atlantic, which is going out of business, right? Not true.
I also used to work for the Jeff Bezos Washington Post, which at the time was an insult, but now may be a term of endearment.
Now suddenly it's a compliment, right? Ashley, the other day, we were talking backstage about this. The other day he attacked you personally by name in a tweet as incompetent or whatever it was, and it was over the fact that you had requested an interview with the White House, and he came back and attacked you and said, send somebody else, not that incompetent Ashley Parker, effectively, right?
Effectively, yes.
Effectively. And he had attacked you before. I mean, it's not the first time this has happened. He's never attacked you by name before? I thought he had attacked you by name.
No, you're correct. He had attacked me before by name.
Right. Does this matter to any of you? I mean, the sort of the 9-year-old name calling, I mean, it's just schoolyard stuff. Does it actually ultimately matter? And how do you respond to it, more importantly, from the standpoint of your coverage?
I mean, interestingly, I thought a lot about the first time he attacked me. In his first term, he attacked myself and Phil Rucker, I think, as nasty lightweights. This time he attacked myself and my colleague Michael Shearer. I felt bad, though, because if you read his attack, he's clearly attacking me, and Shearer is sort of like a casualty of being associated with me.
Right,
yeah, exactly. It's like a drive-by of Sheen of Ashley. But it felt very different. And also, in general, the first term I remember, he would also attack my and other reporters' reporting, not by name always, but it was clear what story he was referring to. And I remember the first time he tweeted out an attack, not by name, but on a story. I remember where I was. Oddly, it was 11 a.m. and I was in a liquor store, but it was because I was going to a dinner that night and I was picking up a bottle of wine on my way into the office. But
It's a good detail.
I remember my heart dropped because for a president of the United States to go after a story, which would happen maybe once or twice in the Obama administration, once or twice in the Bush administration, it meant that you had gotten something wrong. And so at first, I was like, oh my God, what did we get wrong? Who did I talk to? I need to go back and triple check and quadruple check my sources. And I'm so sorry I've brought shame on the Washington Post. And I quickly learned it didn't mean you got anything wrong. It meant that you got everything precisely right. Exactly. It got under his skin and he was coming after you. And oftentimes, 2 or 3 days later, he would send out another tweet that made clear that the premise of your story was absolutely correct. Right. But to finish, the first time he attacked me by name, first term, I remember because it had, again, I didn't, the big concern, of course, is are there threats for you? Are there threats for your family? And luckily, there was nothing credible. So after that, it was kind of this wonderful moment where I got to hear from everyone in my life, right? Like the guy I had gone to homecoming with freshman year reached out. My younger sister had friends from sleepaway camp reaching out. It was like a hearing from, I got to catch up with everyone in my life, right? I heard from 200 people and we all caught up and then moved on. This time when he attacked me, I really didn't hear from that many people, and I was kind of curious why I wasn't getting this great catch-up moment. And I thought about it, and I think it's twofold. One, I think, is Truth Social does not have the reach that Twitter did for whatever reason. I think that's part of it. And I think the other part is in this moment now, 10 years into the Donald Trump show, in a moment where he is, deporting people without due process to El Salvadorian prisons and shuttering whole agencies and maybe touching, or Elon Musk maybe touching entitlements, when things that are happening that have like actual real world consequences for real world human beings, the idea that like he doesn't like a journalist is kind of like no new news, right? Like it's new that on Monday it was me and that he used X, whatever slur it was, but it's not going to move people. Who cares?
Somehow, Elizabeth, him calling Maggie Haberman Maggot Haberman doesn't really mean anything in the context of everything else going on right now, right?
I take your point. I know we're laughing at Ashley's story, and there is a humor to it, and talking about the name calling. I think it must be horrible. I mean, I feel like I just want to say that. Like, it must be horrible. To your question of does it matter, I actually think it does matter because what is happening, the strategy behind it is, it is name calling, and that is part of it. But he's also just trying to discredit the media. He's trying to tell people, don't believe them. Don't believe them. Okay, and I think that is why it matters. I also, just as a human being, I feel like it must be very difficult. I mean, I know, again, that we're laughing, but, to get attacked by name by the President of the United States, it can't be easy. That is intimidating. So the second reason why it is, I think, a very important thing, again, is it's another way to create a disincentive for factual, aggressive reporting on the American presidency, and it sounds silly, the failing New York Times, this, that, and the other thing. But there's actually huge weight behind it, and it is meaningful.
And I should add briefly, I think I make light of it because that's kind of the only way you can deal with getting attacked by name by the President of the United States. But I also felt lucky that in every instance I've been attacked by him when I was at the New York Times, when I was at the Washington Post, and now that I'm at the Atlantic, I always felt like I had the full support of my institution behind me. And that makes a tremendous difference. And I cannot imagine what it would be like to be attacked if you did not have the backing of the Times or the Post or the Atlantic behind you.
And this is really where Elizabeth's point is dead on. Not every organization has the wherewithal to support their journalists in that same way. right?
Well, many of them don't even know how to do that, right? Like, we're all from big organizations, right? When I was at Politico, it's a big organization. At MSNBC, still a big organization. Like, they have security teams at some of these places, people that are always there looking at things. And a lot of news organizations can't afford to have that, right? And so if someone does get named by President Trump or by someone else, and you spend a couple of weeks being yelled at and called names and all of that, a lot of reporters just feel alone. And so I think what we do as their colleagues is, like, especially for those of you that, like, the first time that the Trump War Room tweeted out a picture of me during the campaign, Maggie Haberman texted me, right? And she was like, "I've been through this. How are you? I know this sucks." I think
Maggie and I have been texting back and forth this week, obviously.
Yeah. So, like, so there is like a little bit of a fraternity sorority feel. It's like, oh, come on over to the sad side. And I think, part of it is you have to laugh to keep from crying, because, earlier this year, I had weeks of, when it was around the WHCA making statements about in support of the AP and against what the White House was doing with the polling. It wasn't particularly about my reporting. It was about me as a person. As you guys can tell, I'm Black, I'm gay. Some folks have issues with that. That's their problem.
Yeah. And do you feel like you're more of a target? It would stand to reason you were more of a target because of that.
I think so. I think, that's part of the job, but it's not. I think it's not. It's a new part of the presidency for that to be the case. But the way that I try to explain it to people is, sometimes when you spend like a week with thousands of people on the internet yelling the N-word or the F-word at you, telling you to kill yourself, saying they're gonna come kill you, sending you emails. Sometimes they send letters in the actual snail mail, which I always kind of appreciate that. You spent money to hate me. With, stamp, 5 cents. Those kinds of things, when you walk out into the earth the next day, you kind of, I don't know, I'm like, hold up, who's around, right? And so luckily I have been supported by my news organizations in the same way, where, one, in no way, shape, or form does it change the way that I approach the reporting. I'm not meaner to Donald Trump or the administration or Biden folks, because Democrats do it too, to be very clear, at a different level, or to any president because of what's happening. So you have to separate those two sides of yourself, kind of like Severance.
Well, you're kind of getting at the thing I wanted to ask as the good Severance.
No spoilers.
This is kind of where I wanted to take this. The kind of second part of this is, what's the appropriate response in a case like that, right? I mean, I'm reminded always of Marty Barron, your former boss's admonition that our job is not to go to war, our job is to go to work, right? That the response is not to fight back, but to do journalism. To do journalism, that's what we're there to do. The job is not to call him names back.
That's what the other people are for. That's what the lawyers are for. That's what the editors are for. That's what the PR people are for. That's what the security people are for.
Right.
I recently had a meeting with the security team, and what they told me is, our job is to protect you and make sure you don't have to worry about any of this, right? And so when, the New York Times has to release a statement in defense of Maggie Haberman or Peter Baker, that's who should be doing that. Maggie and Peter, which they do all the time, they just keep going and doing their job, because that's not what we're supposed to do. We try not to become the story.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go to, we could do this for hours more. I'd frankly love to do it for hours more, but we're going to go to some questions from the audience that have been submitted. Let me ask this first one, which seems very much on point to what we're talking about, from Misty Harris. How do you keep your sanity when covering this administration? What can we do as journalists for our own mental health? I mean, this question of self-care in the midst of all this is not a thing, Elizabeth. So as you think about your
It's
team,
an excellent question.
It's an excellent question.
I want to talk to Misty about that. No, I don't have a good answer. The only thing I can just say about how we're trying to approach work in the second Trump administration as differentiated from maybe how we did in the first, is we're going into this knowing what our lives are going to look like, or what and it's, we had a pretty good idea, and here we are. I will say, just from my own perspective, at the Times, we are lucky. We have a nice big White House team.
You have how many people on your team?
We have about 9 people.
So you can rotate people in and out, right?
We rotate people in and out, and I had this big, talk with the reporters at the beginning of the administration, and I said, we're not going to do that thing where every time something happens, everyone turns their attention to it, and everyone's churning, like some people are on their bigger projects, some people are on the news, and we're going to really be like a well-oiled machine. But when you're with ambitious journalists, they always want to be on the news, and everyone is, so it's kind of hard to organize. But I do think that the key is to keep our mind focused on the biggest stories. People have to take their vacations. People have to live their lives, and to just I try to model that by coming to Texas
and working all day.
On a very busy day. Yeah.
Oh yes, because your mental health in Texas will be just perfect.
But I should add, and this sounds very cliche, but the day, well, twofold. One is when Trump attacked me by name this most recent time, I was out for a run. So like, go me, right? Like some work-life balance. And obviously my run gets paused and I get a million calls and I have to get on a Zoom with, all the people at the Atlantic where I don't want to put on my camera because I don't want them to realize that like their new employee is out for a run at 6 p.m. Even though, to be fair, that's a very reasonable time to take a run.
Of course.
But I also have 3 kids who, to be fair, are not always great for my mental health. But this sounds cliche, but like I walked in the door and my 2-year-old just came running up and gave me a hug. And kind of like in that moment, I felt like I'll be okay. Like I have more important things in my life than the president attacking me, and I'll be fine.
That's good. Good perspective. You want to jump in on something on that as well? Sure. Good one? Okay.
I mean, it's the same thing. We just got a puppy. Me and my husband just got a dog, and he's 8 weeks, and had a crappy day. It was one of those like bad, and I walked in, and he came running, and my husband came with him, and my mom called. I was like, did you guys coordinate this? My mom, who lives in Dubai, called. And those kinds of things really help to put in perspective like what we're all doing. Our work is very important, gets more important every year, but us as humans also have to find ways in which to kind of pull ourselves out of it. A good dance party, a good Beyonce dance party, I will say. I did it this week on Wednesday night before I got on the plane here.
Is that right?
Yeah, I had to have it.
I think a Beyonce dance party could be a thing for the next ISOJ.
I'll do it right now if y'all throw some Beyonce.
All right, here's a really good question from Paula. I want to say it's Moralia. Do you think that the fact that tech platforms decided to be so close to this administration is having or will have an impact on the media ecosystem? Ashley, what do you think? I mean, obviously Musk has been in the center of everything for the last 2 months, and X as a consequence. But we also talked backstage about how maybe is X really that much of a factor out in the world these days? We overstate what its impact is?
Yeah, I go back and forth on how much X moves things compared to Twitter, but I also think like these tech platforms are speech, right? They are speech. That's what some of these lawsuits were about. And if you go on X now, the algorithms are sort of pro-Trump, pro-MAGA algorithms, and that's Elon Musk's right to do. But it's reaching a huge number of people in a very specific and at times I think potentially radicalizing way.
But is it really reaching a huge number of people? That's the thing that I legitimately do not know. I mean, the old saying was Twitter is not real life. And I wonder if X is real life in the same way. And are we, because we're down in the well and can only see the walls of the well around us, overstating the importance of this as a feedback loop?
I think that the feedback loop is short. So, when I was at Politico and there was the misinformation that the U.S. aid was paying our bills, which is not true, right? They were paying for Politico Pro, which is a subscription.
Right.
That happened with like some right-wing kind of faceless folks on Twitter. Then it got to Elon Musk. That day at 1:30 or whatever it was, Caroline Levitt from the podium talked about the government canceling all of those subscriptions to Politico or Pro. So it is real life in the sense that the people that actually are paying attention to it are the people who are making the laws, changing the laws, pushing, whatever, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, pushing something. I think that's why it matters, right? Does my grandmother see it? Absolutely not. Does someone's cousin in Iowa see it? Probably not. But the impact on their life will be felt because the people that are making the decisions in Washington, D.C. and around the country in leadership positions are paying attention to those platforms.
Okay, let me ask another one. Elizabeth, I'm going to ask this one of you specifically because of your past AP relationship. From Kate Winkle, what should journalists in local markets, particularly those who are relying on coverage of the White House from bureaus or partners like the AP, keep in mind when covering what's going on in Washington for their local communities?
So when a local reporter out in the field is
I mean, for instance, a lot of local news organizations I know have been trying to localize the cuts at the federal level in terms of how they affect their communities specifically. That'd be one example.
I mean, I would keep, if I were a local reporter, I would have my, I mean, this is kind of like I don't know that they're asking for a story idea, but like, where are I think one thing that we will see spin out of all of these cuts is like, because they're happening so quickly and we're only, we're still quite new in this administration and Elon Musk is, doing his thing, but these people out in the country are the ones who will see, much like people out in the world, will see the effects of the USAID cuts, right? Like, you will be the front line of whatever the effects of these decisions in Washington will be. So that's what I would be keeping in mind for sure. Like, who are the people being affected by this? Who are the people, like any, good reporter out in the field, right?
Yeah.
Like, who's being hurt, who's being helped, what is the meaning of these
And
of these
let me stay with you on this for one more second and give away something that I'm going to talk to Julie Pace about here in a little while, and that is that one of the byproducts of the AP being shut out by the White House is that the AP is a source for many people around the country in their local communities. Many of those communities voted for this administration.
Yes.
Right? And so the loss of AP coverage is a loss of coverage for those communities and those voters. Like, this stuff does have an effect at the local level.
Yeah, I mean, the AP, I thought it was funny how you said most people don't think about the AP.
Well, you think about
day.
the AP because you worked there for a long
No,
time.
but people who don't think about it are affected by it. A lot of the news that they receive is from the AP. Right. And it's just, the kicking them out of the pool, when you look at it, it's an interesting choice when you think about the traditional space that the AP holds in American journalism. Traditionally, the AP essentially is sitting in the front row of the briefing room. And of course, the AP is still in the briefing room, but the AP is right there in that kind of plum position because they are there to represent pretty much all of American media, right? Julie Pace will talk more about this, but it's, so many American newspapers and, media are part of the AP through this cooperative model. So the idea is that the AP reporter would be there to represent, all of those papers. So it is an important decision by the White House.
Okay. I see from our time we have time for one more question. Sharon Stover, where do influencers and their roles fit in the news topography from your standpoint? That's a whole other element of this. And in fact, the president is meeting with these folks. They're being integrated into the coverage map, aren't they?
So I think influencers play a much bigger role on the right than they do on the left. And that's something the left is kind of haltingly and frankly quite unsuccessfully trying to solve. But I think one area where you really saw this was when Joni Ernst was considering not voting for Pete Hegseth's nomination. And Joni Ernst is someone who would have had every reason to be skeptical of him. She was a woman who served in combat, and he had previous statements about not thinking women should serve in combat. She is a public survivor of sexual assault, and he was accused of sexual assault and other misconduct, and so she expressed some hesitancy, and sort of the White House made a decision that if we lose, and again, it gets to their doubling down on everything, but they made a decision. If we lose Pete Hegseth's nomination, then maybe we lose Tulsi Gabbard's, then maybe we lose RFK Jr.'s. It has to go through. So they start coming out against Joni Ernst. But then there's this thing that happens where there's this whole ecosystem that includes influencers. So that includes Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro, all the and the podcast and all the people. Word sort of goes out to them, sometimes officially, that we're going after Joni, right? Like we are going to attack her. So word through official back channels gets to the first layer of Republican influencers of like we attack her until she caves. And then the second and third tier of influencers who are looking for their cues from the first tier see, oh, we're all going after Joni. And they go after Joni.
Yep.
And you see it play out, and the end result is that Joni Ernst comes out and supports Pete Hegseth's nomination.
So the influencers have influence.
On the right, they do.
As their name would suggest. And on the left, as Ashley says, Eugene, they're still sort of struggling, something, Joe Rogan of the left, something. Like
Right,
no one knows what to do about that.
Right. I mean, there's Crooked Media, right? The Pod Save guys, and that's kind of it, right? Like when it comes to people who actually, have members from the administration, the former administration, not this one, come on their actual podcast, like that's kind of what the left has. Why? It's unclear, right? It's unclear why they can't figure it out. I think part of it is there's so many disparate factions on the left that it's hard to build a audience that will go across the entire left side of the aisle, right? That's something very difficult for them to try to figure out. Look, people who have podcasts are free to chat and talk about stories and do all of those things. I think they should do it. There's a lot of podcasts. I'm a big podcast listener. New media, right? That is something that I'm supportive of. Politico, where I worked, is an organization that came up, at the beginnings of, really everyone shifting to .com news sites and digital news sites. However, there is a difference between a journalist with an editor and people who are copy editing and working on stories with them, and someone who has a microphone and is just talking. They should absolutely do that. First Amendment, 100%. Have your opinions, but my issue comes in when it's being presented as if that is a journalist, right? That they're a reporter. It's not the same.
Yeah, all right. My expectations for this panel were high, and they were exceeded. I hope yours were as well. Please give Eugene Daniels, Elizabeth Kennedy, and Ashley Parker a big hand. See you in a little bit. Thank you. That's great work, you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, that was